we'll get started.
Father, we're blessed always for being able to gather together and study your word. It's so important to our daily lives. I'm thankful that Mom has agreed to teach this class, and pray that this class will be exciting to us and help us to willingly study your word in depth. Father, we're always glad for each person here, and for those unable to be here, we extend our prayers to them. Father, we pray for, we're thankful for Jesus, and especially your word now, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Question, this is only my second fall here in Colorado. Is this wind typical
Yes.
of fall in Colorado? Yes, it is. Okay. Kind of?
All year.
So, all year?
Yeah.
On and off.
Windy all the time. Okay.
Spring too.
Spring too. Okay. The fall was always great back east because the humidity just blow all the humidity out.
So that's where it came from.
Maybe so. Yeah, I brought it with me. Okay, let's begin. We're in chapter 7 this week. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapters 16 and 17, so it would be helpful if you have that open. We're going to get to the text in just a few minutes. I find that it's helpful for certain lessons to define our terms, and I'm guessing that maybe the terms that I use in my title might need a reminder on those. So, with that in mind, what is an allusion?
Is it referring to something else?
All right, it's referring to something else. You allude to something, more often than not by hinting at it, sometimes by actually stating it. Technically speaking, an allusion is something, it's a reference, an implied or indirect reference to something else. If you're talking about a story like a David and Goliath, where it's little guy goes up against big guy and wins, without mentioning David and Goliath, you're making an allusion to the story. What is an illusion with an I?
Usually deception.
Usually an intentional deception.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. American Heritage Dictionary says something that is erroneously perceived or construed. So we make allusions to things, but we can use it in an illusory way, which kind of was my point. Okay, how we use certain things about the Bible. We have some other things from the Bible that have come into our language. I don't know whether we want to call them allusions or not, but we use them, and they're references to something in the Bible. Can anybody think of any others besides a David and Goliath type of story?
The writing on the wall.
The writing on the wall. Where's that come from?
It comes from the king that.
No, you're on the right track.
The king of Babylon that wouldn't listen to God's leadings.
Okay.
So they write it on the wall.
Okay, all right. I hadn't thought about that one actually. Do you know what book that's from? Oh, see, I'm putting her on the spot here. I'm sorry?
Daniel.
It's from the book of Daniel. Yeah, exactly. Anybody? Any others that we use?
You scared all the rest of us now.
Just give it to me. I won't ask you where it's from, but I think some of them you probably know. Has anybody in here ever seen the light? Like Paul, who saw the light on the road to Damascus? You know, when somebody gets an awakening about something, they say, well, they've seen the light. They don't necessarily refer, I mean, it's an implied reference to the Apostle Paul, but that's where it comes from. One other one I have in mind.
Blind leading the blind.
Oh, that's what I didn't have in mind. Okay, sure. Okay, comes directly from Christ, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Our society says these things and I have no idea where it even comes from.
Well, I was going to ask you that about David and Goliath. How about, have you been in a situation where at work somebody did something wrong and they became the scapegoat? Sure. They became the
Or
scapegoat.
they did something good and became the Good Samaritan.
Okay, yeah, that could be that too. In your experience, how many people know, well, let's just take David and Goliath, or even the Good Samaritan. How many people do you think know the story as it's told, originally? And know some of the details about that, or even tell you where it's from?
Very few.
You think very few? You had any
They
experience?
might have an idea it's from the Bible.
Yeah. Might have some glimmer of recognition that it sounds familiar to them or something, but yeah, I've talked to a number of people. They know the Good Samaritan, but they don't really know the story of the Good Samaritan. The real, the original story. Jim?
That probably was floating out a lot last night after what happened to the Yankees and Astros. The littlest guy on the field slew the giant, heroic pitcher that struck everybody.
Oh, I missed that one. What happened? Tell me what happened. I didn't catch that.
Jose Altuve is about 5'5", and Aldis Chapman throws 103 miles an hour.
Okay.
Nevertheless, he hit a walk-off home run.
Okay.
I guess I won't have to watch my recording.
Jim, what did you do? You just took about 3 hours of time away from Mike.
You saved me 3 hours.
Saved you
Just
3
say
hours of
thank
time.
you. Right.
Was it good that the Yankees lost?
Yes.
Is that a good thing? Most everybody here. Today, one of the things I tried to do in this chapter was, I'm not quite sure how I want to express this. A number of things we've talked about up to this point have been, I don't know, religious doctrine, concepts, things that are important to us in terms of how we live. And I think this one is as well. But this particular chapter, I tried to address what the world does with God's truth. Okay? And how they more often than not will take God's truth or portions of it, or even little portions of it, and distort it to some degree. Okay? Now I know, Christians do that too. But I think more in terms of the way, in fact, my quote was, culture always corrupts God's truth. Culture always corrupts God's truth. So this is more of a discussion about what sinful humanity does with God's truth and how it takes certain things and distorts it just enough, maybe not even intentionally, but takes stories and uses them to suit their own ways of thinking. I want to address a little bit about question 2. I kind of wondered what you thought about my discussion about that quote that I see on the library wall where I came from, where we just lived. What did you think about that discussion where they took the passage of Christ, know the truth and the truth will set you free, and just put it up on the library wall? Was I?
Well, it sounds nice,
Sounds good.
but, calling the truth whatever you find in the library is obviously different.
Which to me is pretty typical of what the world does with the things of God, with statements about God and statements that Christians or Christianity makes. They take it and kind of, I keep saying they, we do that sometimes too, don't we? We take statements that Christ makes and we take it out of context and we kind of use it to suit our own purposes, maybe like Saul, to justify what we do. Hey, I got all these sheep just so I can sacrifice. Sacrificing is good, isn't it? Yeah, so that's why I did it. So there's any number of ways that that happens, I think. And when we talk about studying the Bible, what's one of the major things we have to remember, really when we read anything, but when we read the Bible, what do we, I'm getting vague here. Let me just say it this way. Context is meaning. Or I should say it this way. Context creates meaning. What's one of the important things we always say about when you read the New Testament? Make sure you look at the context of where that passage comes from. Make sure you understand what's being said around it. And that's really true about reading anything, isn't it? You have to look at the context. A simple example is the word, say certain words. I've done some tutoring for students who are taking the SAT. I haven't done it for a while, so they may have even changed this. But they used to have questions in there which were definitions in context. In the reading passage, they would have a word underlined. You had to look at the word and what does the author mean when he uses this word there. If I were to say if I were to tell you the word spring and ask you to give me a definition of spring, what would it be? What would be your definition of spring?
First thing I thought of is those springs that are in a cliff in.
Okay, a spring that creates a little bit of bounce and tension, that's one.
Season.
The season of the year, a bounce in your step, okay. Spring forward, fall back, we'll talk about that, that's coming up soon.
Water.
Yeah, a place that is a source of water. How do you know which one is the author is talking about? You know it by the context. You know it by what he's saying. You know it by the sentence he puts it in, what else he's talking about. Context creates meaning. And I think that's particularly important when you talk about stories like David and Goliath, the Good Samaritan. Any number of other stories that we have in the Bible make it very important that we understand the context, because you miss something when you take it out of context, don't you? You may miss a really important detail. In question 3, I addressed this issue of our romance with the underdog. Why do we love the stories of the underdog? Person, group, team, whatever, who comes from behind, like Jim was mentioning. The unsuspected person or team who comes out on top. Why do we love that? Why do you love that? Assuming you do. Most people love to see that. What is it about that that you like?
Because in reality, strong win. And so we want to have some reassurance that there's a chance.
Okay, a little bit of reassurance maybe. Perseverance, you admire the fact that the person perseveres, okay?
Usually it's the humble versus the proud.
Okay?
So we like to see the proud and humble.
Ah, okay. Does anybody love it when the New England Patriots lose? You know, I mean, come on, six Super Bowls, Tom. That you mean to tell me that's not enough for you? Or the Yankees. I mean, the Yankees are one of those other teams that they just have, you know, a tremendous record of winning. What was it? I think Yogi Berra, the catcher for the Yankees, he has 10 rings, 10 championship rings. Who has 10? Not very many people. You know, and I think it was in the 50s. They just couldn't lose. They just kept winning and winning, and everybody hated the Yankees. Is that why you love the underdog? Because you hate the people who are always winning? Maybe. You know, you love to see the big guy get knocked off. The proud. You love to see the proud kind of, you know, God hates the proud, so maybe I'm justified for hating the people who are on top. I don't know. There's any good reason we might think of. But we have this, we love to see the underdog win, don't we? We love to see the person come along who just doesn't seem to have what it takes, but manages to win anyway. Okay. So there's something about that that is very appealing to us. So naturally, we might gravitate to calling that a David versus Goliath kind of approach. Interesting. To me, some very interesting thoughts. It's kind of a common thought among us. We love to see the little guy win, at least occasionally, if in fact his cause is just. Maybe that's something else we need to throw into the whole discussion. Is the person justified in winning against the big guy? Who knows?
For me, it's watching somebody kind of overcome the odds, or to deal with a deck of cards that's stacked against yourself and still persist. I guess that's what's always made me root for the underdog.
Okay. Do you feel like that gives the rest of us a chance if maybe we're not in that category of the big guy?
I think it gives us hope.
Yeah, okay. Okay. it can be done. Maybe that's what we like to think.
No matter what the critics say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's probably a lot of stories. You know, we love the, you know, I think America loves the Horatio Alger stories. You can become anything you want to in this country. We love that kind of approach to things, don't we? Let's go to the text for a while, shall we? 1 Samuel 16. Samuel is basically narrative, isn't it? It's telling a story. What's the storyline here? Where are we at with what's happening in this particular part of the narrative?
Transitioning king.
What happens? Who has to get the ball rolling here? Samuel has to get the ball rolling, doesn't he? Why is he afraid about this?
Afraid of Saul.
He's afraid of Saul. Saul's a little unpredictable, isn't he? As we'll see, he becomes kind of predictable, but yet unpredictable in some ways. Basically, what is Samuel doing here? I mean, I know he's anointing a king, but there's a word we might use if some group is trying to overthrow a particular government.
A coup.
It's a coup. He is starting a coup. Quietly, silently, the way God tells him to do it, but he's starting a coup here. He wants to get rid of this administration, and the rest of the narrative is really the struggle of the two administrations here. Even though David technically doesn't really start a new administration just yet, Saul's still in charge, according to what most people want to think anyway. That becomes very clear that, you know, there's a lot of people still on his side. But David now comes along and his power begins to be evident. Right? Anyway, Samuel's starting this, and he's afraid. Bruce?
I think it's interesting here that people are afraid of Samuel.
Yeah.
You know, he's afraid of Saul, but the people, when he enters the village, are afraid of him.
They're afraid of him, aren't they? Yeah. What's he here for? What's going on? Did we do something wrong? Yeah. It is an interesting insight there, isn't it? Do you think they're more afraid of Samuel than they are of Saul? Don't know. Probably can't answer that question. But there's some trepidation on their part about Samuel coming into town. So he just comes into the town under the ruse of having a sacrifice. I say ruse, but I mean he's probably really going to have a sacrifice. But that's why he's there. There's another agenda that he has. The other agenda is to find a new king. So what happens?
He goes through Jesse's sons
Goes through Jesse's sons,
and has to go to the youngest son.
who is not even there.
Yeah, who's not even there. Finally find the king that God wants.
Okay. What's the significant dynamic we always talk about that's going on here between Samuel and God?
Just seeing what God's choices are versus what our choices are.
Big gap between what God sees and what man sees. Okay? Big gap here between what God sees and what man sees. Maybe that's part of the problem with us taking allusions to the Bible and making them what we want rather than what God wants. I don't know if that's a part of that or not. But the first three brothers, apparently, and if you look a little bit later in the narrative, at least the first three brothers are already in the military. I don't know the ages of everybody at this point or what the ages of the other sons are, but at least the first three that come by that are mentioned here, they're already in the military. If you look, it's in, I think, in the next chapter, those same three brothers are mentioned. Okay? They're there following Saul. Now, they're obviously home at this point. I guess they're on leave or something. But they're home here, and so when Samuel asks for them to come by, why does he think the first guy should be the king?
He looks like a king.
Yeah, he probably looks like a king.
Big, tall guy.
Yeah, maybe he's big. You know? You choose up sides for the game. You want the big guys. Or you want the people who at least look the part. Or or you think can play the game. You know, they needed military leaders as their leaders, didn't they? Because they had a lot of battles they had to fight. They had to stay on top of that. So they needed people who could lead the troops. He probably just looked the part. Same with the other two guys, the other four. We don't really know. Their names aren't even mentioned here. But they all come by, and Samuel says, "Nah, God doesn't want any of these." Very interesting statement here that I think is, again, one of the things that we like to use about this passage, isn't it? My translation says it this way in verse 7, humans don't see what the Lord sees. Somebody read verse 7 for me. In your translation may say it a little differently than mine.
But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God does not see as man sees, but man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart.
Okay? Outward appearance. That's kind of what Saul was playing on, wasn't it, when he had the photo op with Samuel worshiping with him? You think about that. That's what he was doing. He was making it look good for public consumption. But it wasn't what God saw. Certainly wasn't even what Samuel saw. Love that statement. Humans don't see what the Lord sees. I don't know, that just seems kind of our struggle, isn't it? We don't see the same things that God sees. And this whole narrative, I mean, all of what Jesus did was trying to open the eyes of his disciples, wasn't he? I love the Gospel of John because one of the things the Gospel of John does, some people call the Gospel of John the spiritual gospel. And if you read through it, there's any number of times where Jesus is trying to elevate the thinking of his disciples and everybody who's following him. Stop looking at physical things, look at spiritual things. There's about 3 or 4 or 5 different episodes in John where he tries to make that very clear. And nobody seems to be getting it. Nicodemus, for example. Nicodemus comes at night. And when Jesus tells him you got to be born again, he goes, I don't get it. He's thinking about physical birth there. He's thinking about entering your mother's womb for a second time. And Jesus says, no, you're not getting it. I'm talking about a spiritual rebirth here. So it seems to me a lot of what the Old and New Testament are doing are trying to elevate that, trying to get us out of a human way of thinking and thinking about God. Yeah.
That passage should give us hope and comfort, but it also should give us pause. It gives us hope when we look at ourselves and we see our flaws and say, you know what? It gives me comfort that God knows my heart. In spite of the mistakes I make, things I do wrong, I'm comforted by the fact that God looks at my heart and not the outward appearance. But it should give us pause when we consider others, because we see their outward appearance, and we draw conclusions, perhaps, based on what we see in their behavior or whatever. And it should give us pause because God knows their heart, and we do not.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think it also gives us pause to think that God knows our hearts as well, Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not just comfort sometimes. This just came to my mind. Is it Psalm 132? I'm sorry. There's a. I can't remember what psalm it is now, where David says, "Test my heart and try me." It's in the latter psalms, isn't that 132, something here? I can't remember.
139.
There you go. All right, thank you. 139.
Verse 23.
Verse 23. Thank you. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my concerns. See if there's any offensive way in me. Lead me in the everlasting way. That's the challenge, isn't it, for God? Asking God, look at me. Anything that's there that's not according to your ways, get rid of it. Help me know those things. Okay? But that's David, by the way. We're moving into David's character here now. We're going to see a lot of that over the next couple of chapters. I'm trying to remember if I mentioned this very much. I don't think I did in the book. I think, and this is just something for you to think about later, David killing Goliath, for him, really wasn't a big deal. It was not a big deal for David. I think the real challenge to David's faith came later on, when he had to run from Saul, when he couldn't just go out, get a stone, and throw it. It was a whole different experience for David. And I think that shaped his faith in a way more than this David and Goliath. We'll talk about that in just, I want to talk about David's preparation for this. Yeah, Bruce.
Well, just to follow up on what you're saying, look at David in the cave where he cuts off a piece of Saul's robe, and then he feels horrible.
Feels bad about it, yeah. Yeah.
And all his men are saying, kill him, kill him, kill him.
Yeah, David says, it's not the way of God, is it? I think he probably was, would have made my life a lot easier, wouldn't it? Just get rid of the guy, man. Hey, stop chasing me and just leave me alone, man. Let me go be the king the way I want to be king. But he doesn't do that because there's something else going on. Verse 13 in this section, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon David powerfully. That's back in 1 Samuel 16. Okay. Let's move into chapter 17 for just a moment or two. And the question that I think is a good one is question 4, where I ask us to think about what was David's preparation for this encounter? How was David ready for this? Being a shepherd. Tell me a little more about that. Why was that good preparation for him?
He said God had given these animals into his hands. So it was humbling, and it was also giving God the glory.
Yeah. He puts God into he interjects God into this thing. He said, God's the one that says, help me with this. One of my instructors at graduate school was always fond of saying, you know, it's one thing to go up against some wild animals with high-powered rifles, even bow and arrows. How about sticks and rocks? Are those good weapons to have against wild animals? Well, I'm sure they knew how to use them. I'm sorry?
If you're a good thrower.
If you're a good shot, maybe, which apparently David was, had to be, but where did he get that power from? He recognizes where it came from. Yeah.
I always think of David sometime as a young shepherd boy at night, just to lay down, look up. The area that he was in, no city lights, no lights at all, and to contemplate the majesty of the stars and being and I kind of put myself in his place of looking at that thing up in the sky and realizing God created this, and look at all of the majesty that's there. And over the years, I think that there was a closeness that was developed through that, his awareness of the creation.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm looking real quick here to see if David was the one that wrote Psalm 19. Yeah, it was a Psalm of David. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse proclaims the work of his hand. He thought about that, hadn't he? And he put that into his thinking. But David was ready for Goliath. What does he say to Saul?
He said that, this thing I like about David, he said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So he recognized that it was God who helped him prevail against the lion and the bear. It wasn't by his own great strength and skill.
Right.
God did that.
Right.
And God will do the same thing in this
Okay.
situation.
Isn't it interesting that he picked up a couple extra tones just in case, just in case.
He was ready. He knew how to prepare himself, but he also knew how to knew where his strength came from. Do you guys look at some of your own past experiences for how to deal with future faith challenges? That's really what David's doing here, isn't it? He sees what God has done for him, and he's using that as a foundation for, well, you know, I've been through this before. I have to trust God's going to get me through it again. Okay? So that's really a part of what our faith does for us, doesn't it? It prepares us for other encounters, rather than go through the whole process again of worrying about what's going on with, well, kind of have to think back. We have to have somewhat of a memory of what God has done for us, and use that as a foundation for what comes next. But you know, here this is like David's like, I got this, Saul. Don't worry about it. Me and the Lord, we got this. But that's really what he tells Saul, isn't it? It's kind of amazing, and with good reason we look at David as an example of tremendous faith. But he was ready for this. This wasn't something new for him. Okay, it wasn't something new. Bruce?
I think it's interesting that Scripture records that David chose 5 smooth stones out of the stream bed. I've heard it said, and we don't know if it's true, but Goliath had 4 brothers.
I don't know about that, yeah.
But think about that. The confidence to say, I know God is going to guide this.
Okay.
And if his brothers come out, I'm taking them too.
Okay. To me, there's a real interesting irony about this. What was the bargain that Goliath kept telling the Israelites would be the bargain, whoever won? All right, if we win, you're ours. If you win, we're yours. Did that happen? No. Goliath lied. Okay, basically he lied. That was never going to happen, which might be somewhat typical of, you know, a situation like that. I don't know, this part of this kind of strikes me as funny here. What did you think about the discussion? Well, let me ask this first. Are there any other significant features about chapter 17 that stand out to you? Any other statements that you think are ones that we should remember? John?
I thought it was interesting in this faith discussion, and I never thought of this before until I was reading for this week's lesson. Not only was he challenged from outside, he was challenged from in with the brothers.
Yeah.
And often when we do step out in faith, it's not like you got the whole team going, yeah, you know, we're with you. I mean, even before, even his indignation of this Philistine challenging the army of the Lord, his brothers are going, you little upstart, you know. Go back.
Don't use the language they probably use there, John.
Go back to daddy and your sheep. And so, you know, we'd like to think when we truly step out in faith, the team's behind us.
Yeah.
That's not always the case.
Got some serious sibling rivalry going on here, don't we? Yeah. Yeah, I read a very, very interesting take on, was it Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, his statement before the Virginia legislature. Well, not everybody just rose up and said, yeah, let's go get them. There was a lot of people who said, no, back off on that a little bit, man. You know, these, you know who we're fighting here. So not everybody was with him when he made that statement. Yeah, Mike.
Well, you kind of point out in your book that the real David and Goliath story here was not the young David against this great power Goliath. The real David and Goliath story was the Goliath going up against the all-powerful God.
There you go. Yeah.
That's the true David and Goliath story here.
Yeah, pagan gods versus the living God.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what this story is really all about. And that's why, you know, this is just a premonition of what's going to happen in the New Testament. That God is in fact, I read somewhere, somebody said that the entire Old Testament is one long diatribe against all the other gods. Trying to convince everybody there's only one. Okay? Monotheism is the basis of the Old Testament, isn't it? There's one God, that's it. All the others, they're just pretenders. So that's really the essence of what's going on here. So, any other statements in this section stand out to you?
46.
46, which says what?
This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. That's pretty amazing to just say that to this monster. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel.
Okay. One other part of this strikes me,
Verse 47.
which says,
All those gathered here, including the Philistines, all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's,
there you go.
and he will give all of you into our hands.
That's probably the essence of this story, isn't it? You know, the Lord doesn't need to win by sword or spear. God has power beyond those things. What do you think about the dialogue between David and Goliath here? There's something to me that strikes me kind of funny. You guys know what trash talking is, right?
What am I, a dog that you come
Yeah.
after me with sticks?
Yeah, this is the ancient version of trash talk. You know, that's really what they're doing, aren't they? They're just, it's a bantering back and forth. I'm going to feed you to the birds and the... Oh, no, you're not. Here's what's really going to happen. Okay? Well, I don't know. That just always strikes me funny that human nature is still the same in some ways. There's always some kind of trash talk going on. I'm going to win. No, I'm going to win. Blah, blah, blah. You know, you go on and on and on. But it's just funny to me that it seems to me to be somewhat the same.
Can I mention something about trash talking?
Okay.
Ahab didn't do anything good in his life except one thing. He said when he was threatened, and this opposing general is just going on and on about
I know
how
that's, yeah, go ahead.
I've killed all these guys, I've beaten, and their gods didn't save them. What do you think your God's going to save you? And he said, this is the ultimate trash talk response.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
One who is putting his armor on should not boast as one who is taking his armor off.
Yeah. I told my boys, if anybody gives you a hard time at the beginning of the football game, say that to them. And I think John said it once, the kid went, what? He had no clue what he was talking about. But yeah, that's pretty typical. And he was one of the few things they did and said that was right, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, question 6 was kind of get into the personal with us. When situations seem insurmountable, how can we be certain that God's power will help us overcome? And I had kind of a corollary to that question. When might we need to wait for the Lord? I was waiting. When might we need to wait for the Lord rather than rush into battle? I'm thinking of Isaiah 40, 30, and 31, where he talks about waiting for the Lord. When might that be an important, battle strategy, rather than rushing into battle like David did? That's just some personal thought. Anybody want to share anything about how they deal with situations that seem difficult to overcome? I mean, we can all say, well, it's just a matter of faith, which is true, but what other things are going on for you when those things happen, John?
I found it extremely helpful to just turn to the people around me that have went through very insurmountable things and continue their faith. I find great comfort in visiting with them because usually there's a lot of wisdom there.
Okay. It's kind of helpful to know somebody else has done it and they managed to live through it, didn't it? Okay.
Even when it didn't come out like they wanted.
Okay.
They managed to see the hand of God in it all.
Okay.
And stay faithful.
Sure. Larry?
And a lot of times when we're in a difficult situation, we're wanting an immediate response to get out of that situation without realizing, okay, God, I know that your will be done. Help me, give me strength until that time, because I know that you will provide me the wisdom and the answers to what your will is needed for me. But sometimes we're so impatient, we want, pray for it, tomorrow it'll be done. And so many times, and often it's not that way.
Yeah, we want to get a rock and we want to hit the guy in the head. Basically, that's what we want to do, you know, and that's what David was able to do. That's all. That's why I say David's faith grew more later on, because things didn't happen right away for him. I mean, it was, Saul was in power for 40 years. Now, I don't know at what point in there that David came along, but it wasn't in the 39th year. Okay, so he had to live a long time still waiting for God to bring about what God said he was going to do. He had a lot of things he had to go through before he got to that point. His faith had to develop in some ways that he wasn't prepared for at first, I don't think. Which is, to me, that's a part of what happens in the rest of the narrative here. How David's got to live with some of what he's dealing with, rather than just go get a rock and kill the guy. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Anybody else have any insights? John, I like what John said, because we need other people around us, don't we? We need people with close relationships with us, members who are on the same page. And I think we'll see as we get into Jonathan at some point. He and Jonathan were very much on the same page.
Not all the heroes of faith are just in the Bible. I've lived with a few.
Okay, okay. You like those people because they I think, as you were saying, it kind of gives us the possibilities. It helps us see the possibilities that, you know, people of faith undergoing what seem like insurmountable odds, they manage.
One of the ones that I think we can all relate to is that we live long enough to realize that we thank God often for not giving us our way that day.
Okay.
Because in hindsight, we were dead wrong.
Yeah. Humans don't see what God sees. Yeah. Humans don't see what God sees. Bruce.
I think it's interesting that it seems like it happened real quickly, but from the perspective of Saul and the army, this has been going on for 40 days. Every single day, but nothing's happening.
Yeah.
The guy comes out and taunts him every morning, but there's no action.
No.
And then that had to be grinding on and on and on. You're in the camp, you go out and line up for battle every day, this guy comes out and challenges you to bring peace.
Yeah.
How come they just didn't go after? How come the Philistines just didn't chase them down the hill and slaughter them? You know, you think about that. There was some kind of this was dragging on, and there was some kind of a show happening here. And so then David arrives, and everything changes because he's relying on God.
Yeah.
From a human perspective, this wasn't quick.
Yeah. No, it was not quick. It wasn't quick. Despite the fact that they could have been relieved of being pestered by the Israelite IRS. You know, I mean, he says, you know, you won't have to pay taxes if you get this guy. Nobody thought that was worth the trouble.
I can't imagine looking up at a 9.5-foot tall guy.
No, thank you. And again, going at him with sticks and rocks. He couldn't even carry Saul's equipment. It just wasn't enough. Think about, and I mean, I don't know if you read this or not, but go back later today and read Revelation, is it 4, what are the chapters? 2 through 3? I always get it wrong. The 7 churches of Asia. For every single one of those churches, he says essentially the same thing. To him who overcomes, I will give. Now, in each of the 7 churches, he says he offers them something a little different. But the point is, overcoming. To him who overcomes, to him who overcomes, to him who overcomes. Our faith is a lot about overcoming, isn't it? It's not by our own power, which is sort of the essence of, I think, David's life, certainly. But it really is an overcoming. We have a lot to overcome in this life because the forces of evil have set themselves against us. Personally, corporately, however you want to think of it, those forces of evil are out there. Now, I don't want us to be walking around like this all day long, you know, looking over your shoulder. But the fact is, evil is present. Evil is present. We are called to overcome. A lot of details go into helping that to happen, but the fact is, that's our step. That's what we have. Any final comments or thoughts? Yes, Dan.
I'll often refer to what Paul says, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. It's kind of like win-win. You know, I'm going to focus on doing what Christ wants me to do. And if I fail physically, I still win.
Yeah. Yeah. Good place to stop. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody's comments. Let's keep it up.